We have an hour and 15 minutes left of our time for panel discussion, and this is free, open conversation. So these four gentlemen have heard each other over the last 24 hours, and it's a chance to ask questions of one another, hopefully develop some thought, and yeah, I'm excited about it.
Who starts?
You.
I do start? Well, I want to thank everybody, first of all. I think it's, I think for a lot of people and for us, it's exciting. It's the first time I met Paul, and seeing you together is wonderful. And discovering Richard and all these people here as well, it's just been great. And so, I mean, I guess obviously, I know I'm not going to have a chance to talk to John, so I want to ask him. I want to ask him in terms of, because one of the parts of my talk was formulating some ways to deal with some of the issues that we're struggling with in terms of talking about distributed consciousness and how some of the terms you're using can connect to the manner in which ancient people viewed the world. And for those who don't know, and you mentioned it in your talk, there's been some criticism coming our way from some scholars in, I think they're British, I'm not even sure where they're from, saying that we're obfuscating, of course, and we're just trying to give excuse for religious language or whatever. But I think we know, like I know, that one of the things at least I'm trying to do is trying to connect, to try to come in with a spirit of generosity towards our elders, but also towards these new development in cognitive science. And so I'd like to know what you thought about some of the solutions that I was, maybe not solutions, but at least paths that I was proposing to think about these things.
Excellent. I'll say it to everybody else because I said it to you. I thought that's your best talk I've ever heard you give. So maybe you should consider winging it more often. I could never do that, but I like to plan very carefully and then pretend that I'm winging it, which is a different strategy. So there's a lot there. First, I want to reply to the point you raised of the criticism, and there's a longer version of an argument, but I'll give a truncated version of it, and then I want to reply to some of the things you were saying in the talk. So the first as a proposal comes straight out of 4E cognitive science. It's now being regarded not even as that controversial. I've published a bunch of papers in important journals on cognitive science. With work I did with Dan Chappie about the NASA scientists moving the rovers around on Mars as a specific case study. The idea that cognition is not just individual but distributed. The idea is that networks of human beings are like our networks of so we network computers together in the internet. We release the power of distributed computation. We can network embodied brains together, release the power of distributed cognition. The idea is that most of our problem solving is actually done with the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. I didn't invent English. I'm not running the electric grid. I didn't make this microphone. I didn't build this building, right? And so we've tended to sort of blind ourselves to this because of the Enlightenment's emphasis on autonomy, and then Locke's notions of individualism and things like that, which I think can be independently questioned on philosophical grounds. But the idea in cognitive science is that there is a collective intelligence for distributed cognition that has problem-solving abilities. That's why it's cognitive. That is not it can solve problems that individuals can't solve, and no, it's not just a summative aggregate. There's some mathematical proofs for that, and so that's the idea of distributed cognition. And then the idea is have human beings related to that superordinate agency in the past by thinking of gods and angels. This is not a bizarre proposal. I mean, it's the core of Durkheim's whole approach to religion, the idea that that's what ancient people were talking about And so, again, those two parts, I think, are not obscure. One, I think, is very clearly and independently argued for by central people within cognitive science. And I think there's just more and more empirical work. I mean, Hutchins showed this way back in the 80s. There's no one person that navigates a ship. It's a bunch of people, a dynamical system, including technology, that actually navigates the ship, and that's what you should be looking at for how you manage a ship. And like I said, the recent case studies that Dan and I did about the NASA scientists moving the rovers around. And what was interesting there is when you take a look at some of the ethnographies that were done, these scientists start using language spontaneously that has a religious feel to it. The rover very much becomes a totem for them in the Durkheimian sense. I'm not using that word, that's the word that came from the ethnographer. And so all of that, I think, is not obscure. I think that is very well placed. So I'll let you intervene, but I just want to say that I think the response to the criticism is get more educated and actually take a look at the literature and what is being talked about. Now, the issue, and this is the issue where you and I are in dialogue, is the degree to which the religious, I guess I'll just call them terms as a neutral as much as I can, should be understood sort of as a literal reference or more in an imaginal sense, as a way by which we can be put into contact with these hyper agents and in proper relationship. But I think the first part, the accusation of obscurantism, I think is just misplaced. So that's how I would reply to that point. Did you want me to break, or did you want me to reply to the other?
No, that's fine. I agree, and I think anybody who heard the podcast, it's called Decoding the Gurus. If you want to hear it, you can listen to it. I think that, to me, it was exemplified in the very last part when you said, oh, there's a difference between a demon and a daemon, and we haven't been able to talk about that. And they're like, oh, this ridiculous guy, demons, daemons, demonium, it's all, silly. Like, this is a classical distinction that has existed from the beginning of Christianity, to talk about the difference of what Socrates is describing in his experience and the way that Christians understand demons as parasitic beings. And I was like, if you don't know that and you're an anthropologist of religion and you're making fun of someone for making that distinction, it's very frustrating. So thank you.
I think the fact that they giggle like adolescents is the most powerful criticism that can be brought against them. I find that their manner is so disrespectful and of the people they're claiming to be addressing that I'm not really too interested in their content. Yeah, I like how Richard is conducting himself here. I know from what I've read, he doesn't agree with a lot of the metaphysics, but do you see the respect and the decorum he brings into the conversation? That's how one should comport themselves if they're a true seeker of knowledge, right?
I am outnumbered.
That's great. That's great.
I thought your idea, so as you know, me and a bunch of other people, Daniel Zaruba, Johannes Niederhauser, John Rusin, a lot of the third wave Platonists, we're trying to reintegrate phenomenology and Platonism, and argued that the Kirkland's book is great about this, that the phenomenological interpretation of Plato is the best interpretation. The original meaning of form wasn't a formal structure, it's the look of something, the aspect of something, and trying to get into that. And so the way you then took that, and because I've been doing a lot on the idea of the through line through all the multiple aspects, that itself is not any aspect, and how you actually never perceive the whole of an object, but you think you do, and all of that cog-sci stuff. But there was a lot, and so I don't mean to damn by exclusion. I'm just the idea that the relationship between the one and the many in the object is, because I've been thinking of it just in terms of the bottom-up, top-down emergence emanation stuff that's going on in cognitive science, but the way you reinterpreted it as something like a kind of sacrificial relationship between the aspects and the through line, and the through line and the aspects. And that in that sense, if I'm right, you're trying to see an ontological analog for love, so that love, when we're in love, we're actually participating in a way that is also found in how things are participating in their being, and that love then there gives us a participatory experience of something central to the ontology of things. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
that's it. Yeah.
Okay. I thought that was really good. I thought that was really profound. Because I've been, there's this whole thing coming through, and, it starts in Plato and it comes all the way through, and it's running through the entire tradition, and then it's lost with Descartes and the proposal of a universal method that comes to fruition in Leibniz's proposal of the universal calculus. But before that, you have the idea that no, there's many things, and this is Heidegger too, I believe. There are many truths that are not disclosed to us unless we are willing to go through transformation. And then your point, which I agree with, that relevance realization is not cold calculation, it's caring, and then truths can come through that if we care in the right way, a transformative relationship to our caring, which is love, and then that gets us into a way of realizing sort of a fundamental ontology of things. Sorry, I'm trying not to use a lot of multisyllabic technical jargon, but I'm just getting this thought now, so I have to fall back into where I feel safe. So, but I thought that was really, really good, because I've been trying to understand this love is its own way of knowing, which is a slogan that runs through the whole Neoplatonic tradition, and in Plato, and you can see it in Plato, and you can see it all the way through. And so I thought you clarified that in a really, really profound way. That's what that I thought was just excellent. I really. Was it everything I said fair?
No, it's very fair. Yeah, it's very fair. I think my biggest question, I don't want to monopolize the discussion though. Like, my biggest question is especially the notion that if we understand transpersonal beings as working through at least something like a distillation of man, like incarnational principle at least.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
That solves a lot of the problems of how it is that this. So it's like, let's say the Mars rover, right? So the Mars rover, the purpose of the Mars rover is actually a human purpose. It's not a Mars purpose. Like, it has nothing to do with Mars. It has nothing to do with a curiosity and a desire to enact something. And so then that totem, rises above, you could say, and then it's causal. It causes people to experience.
Yeah, they all bind themselves to the life of the rover in really interesting ways.
But the best way to understand the reality of that is to not be afraid of saying, like, these are human. It's the human good, or the good that draws the human into, that is making that possible. So it avoids, because some of the problems is, like, if you think of these angels as have autonomous existence, or these beings as having autonomous existence, it causes a problem. But if you understand that something like we are meant to rule over them.
So does that, well, there are two things that come up for me for that. And, like, again, I don't want to monopolize, but you and I are really sparking off each other right now. I can feel it. One is, what's your ontological commitment around that? Does that mean that you would say these entities don't exist unless there are human beings in existence? And then related, are you? I mean, because we're now when we have dynamical systems theory and complexity theory, we are willing to posit these weird kinds of entities, like strange attractors in state space, right? And we talk about that, and they sort of represent that sort of data compression you're talking about. And there's a sense in which they're real, and they have an explanatory function, but there's a sense in which they're not real, like the way physical objects are real. They don't have a fixed spatio-temporal location. Like, evolution isn't an object. You can't, there it is over there, right? It's distributed across time and space, and it represents a sort of attractor function within state space, and that it's an abstract object, but it's not abstract in the sense of not being causally present. You know, that's what I'm trying to get at. And so, my first question is, do they exist without human beings, to your mind? And you can give a qualified answer to that. It's not yes/no question. And the second one is, when I heard you talk about that, I was saying, oh, it sounds like you're talking about a hyper-object that is best imaged through the image of a human being, or a hyper-agent even. And is that what you're talking about? So, you know, Morton has the idea of that this is the era of hyper-objects. We've discovered evolution, we discover global warming, and there isn't one place or one physical object, right, where it is, but it's a hyper-object. Is that what you're talking about as well? So those two questions. And
Well, the first question is complicated because I would say that whatever exists without man is so completely inaccessible to us that there's no point in even talking about it. Right?
So I worry about that answer.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that premise can often lead you down a line, and you know, there have been famous philosophers who have taken it, from Pythagoras all the way through, Kant and others, that you then get that we actually don't know things as they are in any way. We are actually locked inside our subjectivity.
Yeah, so I definitely don't believe that. I think that's also why so I think, I'm sorry, I get back to St. Maximus because I think he gives the best solution. Like he
and thank you for putting me on to Maximus, by the way.
So he talks about, in a very Platonic manner, he'll say something like the forms exist, like the essences exist, but those essences are, the laboratory of those essences is man. And so the place where they get gathered into is man. And when he says man, he ultimately means Christ. So even before we get to Jesus Christ, the notion of the anointed one, or the one that holds, that is chosen from above, you know. And so that image, so is it a hyper object? You could say that it appears to us as the source of our humanity, right? It's the thing that makes us recognize that we all are the same somehow, that we all share enough in common that we can recognize our commonality. And so that would be the heavenly man, is the way, at least in Daniel, it seems to be described, or the Adam Kadmon that Philo talks about. Where we say it sometimes, when we say man or human with a capital, you know, we have this sense. Or when we say people or humans, like if humans existed, you know, it's like there's only a manner in which that comes together. So I know I'm being a little fudgy here, but I'm also exploring, I'm also trying to figure out a way to present this in a way that I think can help the problem of the hyper agents. Because like that hyper agent that you talk about, like the Mars rover, you could say it's a huge.
The hyper agent is actually all the human beings, all the equipment, and the Mars rover. It's not the Mars rover. The Mars rover just.
Well, in the Mars rover project, you could say the Mars rover becomes a totem. Let's say.
That's right.
But let's say that hyper agent is a human-shaped hyper agent.
I see. So
It's not something else. It has a human form. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Well, okay, then explain it to me, because I don't quite see it.
Paul, can you help me? Come on.
I'm watching this conversation through Richard's eyes.
Oh yeah.
Because we have the university, we have the monastery, we have the church, and we have the village. So this conversation that you two need to have, you need to keep having it, because that's very much one of the conversations that we're getting at. But when we started this conference, John had a speech, and I was in a little bit of terror, not because I'm afraid of John or I'm afraid of our relationship, but I sense the presence of the university, the monastery, the church, and the village. And this morning, Richard made a speech, and I thought, well, it's going to be interesting to see how Jonathan responds to that. And in a sense, we picked up the conversation that we started last night between, that you were having. And so then I thought, well, what is this thing that we're doing here in this space? And I thought, well, science, and I very much enjoyed your talk this morning. And I thought your talk this morning very much connected with the conversation that you and I had in terms of this question about consciousness. What exactly are we doing? And I think part of what we're doing is we are trying to continue the process of integrating what we have learned through science and its daughter, modern technology, into the very old structures of the church, the monastery, and the academy. And now most of the people here, because they bought tickets to this place, are up to speed. And I remember talking to Richard when I first got here, I was thinking, how on earth is this man going to catch up with all of the strange things that we are saying? And so then I was listening to you two talk together and thinking, and so then Jonathan had to go into, wow, I've got, many hours of video in which I am talking about the sports team and the town and the body and the, and the conversation that you two were just able to pick up with right away, which is what many have come to see is this, but you're also here. And I think that's vitally important, because if we're going to, I'm personally not terribly worried about our critics.
That's good.
Maybe because I'm not in the academy.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know why you're worried.
I'm preoccupied.
But the challenge is, here we have one of us on stage, brought into conversation, and in some ways, we believe that what we're talking about right here, is enormous. Your question to Jonathan, are these hyper agents and hyper objects, do they exist without humanity? Oh, what a question. But that is pastorally, so I'm speaking from the church chair here. Pastorally, these things that we are dealing with, I find to be so much of the vital assumed inheritance of Christendom that is beneath our institutions, and now which was the mother of modern science and modern technology. And what we are trying to do, I think, in this conference, correct me if I'm wrong, is one tiny little step towards integration. And so the intelligibility of our monkish and ecclesial, now you two share an institution, the intelligibility of what we're doing here has everything to do with, our critics. And in terms of pastoral ministry, the church can't turn away its critics. The church almost always has to bring the critics in. And I know that's not a very Protestant thing to do. Protestants are critics leaving. But I think part of what this event is about, and the reason that we are not 3 on stage but 4, is because if this little corner of the internet doesn't figure out how to continue to talk to the village, we will in some ways suffer the fate of the church that Scott talked about at the beginning of this. Because here we are. And we're going to debate about these things. And I think we are right that what we are doing is of vital interest to the village and the world. But we're going to have to bring our friend here into the conversation somehow and have this intelligible for him if this debate is going to be meaningful.
So, Paul, I'd just like to add that there are other people attending for whom this is a new vocabulary, a new conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I guess that's part of the role of the church. Because the posture of the church, I'm not saying that to the exclusion of the academy or the monastery, but the role of the church is always looking out to the village in a way that the academy and the monastery, they look in different ways. So I just wanted to bring that in here because, yeah, what you say it is true. I take your classes, so I wonder what's going on here. So I just want us to, I don't know, to have the four of us on stage. I think that's a pretty big thing for us to think about. So what are you hearing?
Well, could I ask a question first about the planning for this and how you came to choose this group of speakers?
I would love to.
I have to admit, I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to answer that question, actually. Well, in talking with Scotland about planning this event, one of the things that was most attractive was the spirit of conversation between these three men, where you can see the dialogue, there's difference of opinion, difference of perspective, but they talk and they further one another's thoughts in a way that's generous but still firm in themselves and what they believe and what they see. And then pushing forward one another in that spirit of dialogue. And I very much wanted a space for that to develop and grow, and I wanted that spirit brought here so that when this is done, we've had that in Northwestern Ontario as well. And so that spirit of dialogue would remain. And so it was really important to me to have a significant portion of our time together be local, be someone here. And so you, as a very local, you live nearby, you're around in the Abbey, and your particular focus is on consciousness. And so it felt like what a natural fit that you would be in this community, an expert in consciousness, and it would dovetail well with this conversation and give us a chance to, in this area, hopefully carry the flavor of dialogue forward. A dialogue that is honest, engaging, inquisitive, and caring. That was the thought process.
So, in my talk, I wouldn't call it a speech. That sounds,
Sorry.
That sounds like a political vote for me. In my talk, I was, my whole project is I've been trying to build a bridge. And so I gave, to my mind, I think I can back this, I gave a completely, I attempted to give a completely naturalistic account of both the nature and function of consciousness that also said a lot about its phenomenology in a way that connects up with altered states of consciousness without invoking otherworldly or supernatural ontologies. And in that sense, that's my commitment to the scientific endeavor. And that's where I think Richard and I have a lot in common. But then I was trying to do it in such a way that that discussion about consciousness could address the concerns that we have been sharing about existential meaning, a sense of connectedness, the sense of the sacred. And so I very much was trying to create something that would serve as a bridge between the two. That was my intent, Richard, when I gave my talk.
And I thought your talk, especially towards the end, very much came into this question of, I found your stories about, I mean, the statement you made about the fact that this Juan Torres, none of our tools of recognizing consciousness in a human being were effective.
But I think, sorry for interrupting, but this is something I wanted to talk to Richard about. I mean, I think it's not just our tools. I think it's a theoretical framework, and one that's predominant in neuroscience, and which is actually being undermined by a lot of current work, which is an anatomical localization model of cognitive function, which has been dealt some pretty devastating blows by the work of Michael Anderson after phrenology, a lot of other people, and and also the incredible failure rate of trying to find the the neural correlative consciousness as an anatomical region. And so most people have given up on that and have moved towards, can we look for sort of scale invariant functionality, self-organizing criticality, small world network formation, as a way of trying to track consciousness, as opposed to looking for neuroanatomical locations, which I think both the empirical evidence and the theoretical argument has pretty much devastated and undermined. And so, and I'm not casting dispersion on Torres, but I'm just, like, the way he was looking is still out of that framework. And so, and again, I'm not trying to be dismissive, but I would say, well, of course you're not going to find it looking that way, because, and it doesn't mean that, oh, there's something spooky going on. It just means there is a fundamental mistake in your framework that will preclude you from finding what you're looking for. It's like the drunk person who looks for the keys under the light that they lost in the dark parking lot. Well, why are you looking there? Well, I can see better. No, but that's not the point. You have to go where the phenomena is in the right way. So, I mean, that was one of my initial response to that. It was like, I can't, again, not just, your talk was excellent, but I'm not being dismissive of Torres. I think what he was trying to do is great, but not Torres, but what's the researcher who was talking about Torres? I forget. The person who was looking at sort of parietal area and other areas as a way of, with the tennis and
Bowman.
Pardon me?
A.J. Noah.
Oh, that's right. Sorry. So I'm sorry. I was confusing it with the case of the person who wasn't found, Torres. But the point I'm making is, like, yeah, but that's not the right way to look anymore. And that would be my initial response. Or even just a question to you. Isn't it the case that the part of why we're failing is not just because we don't have the adequate technology or something like that, but we might have the fundamentally wrong epistemological framework that precludes us from looking in the right way?
And I think it's right there in the question of the framework, where we can, that's exactly where the contribution of this little corner, thank you, Sevilla, where is she?
Right there.
There she is. Thank you, Sevilla, who gave us that. It's there that I think we can bring to the village a conversation of intelligibility. Because all of this question of, well, why did you talk about us leaving a spirit in Thunder Bay? I mean, when I go through the border, did you leave anything in Canada? I left a spirit. We left a spirit in Thunder Bay. Well, how did we leave it? Well, we left some in a professor, and we left some in an abbey, and we left some in the people, and I guess some are going to Winnipeg with it too. So, but it's this framework question that I think in many ways our project has been trying to integrate. Because for example, when I was listening to you two, I didn't quite want to jump out of my chair, but I felt it, that, how can we help? I think what we're doing in this little corner of the internet is trying to help people see that which is unseen because it's always been around them, but it's been draining from the environment. And now that it's draining, and I think that's your point, Jonathan, about why can we see these things now? Well, there's this lake in California, Mono Lake, which has these tufa formations, and you can look it up on the internet. And those tufa formations were always there, but when Los Angeles and other water districts started taking water, not from the lake because it's all very salty, but from the streams leading into it, which I think is exactly the metaphor of what's been happening in the culture. You know, the churches are no longer putting this stuff in the lake. Well, the level reduces, and suddenly there's these tufa formations, and we get these weird artifacts of, why are we going to leave a spirit in Thunder Bay? What an odd thing to say. And so I think this is the potential and the need of this little corner of the internet to continue these nerdy little conversations in a space like YouTube where we can do it for hours, but also begin to have an eye to the village.
Well, that's why I raised the question too, Richard. First, I wanted to hear his answer. Did my question make sense to you, Richard? That
Made absolute sense.
Yeah.
I guess what I would ask you then is there a better technology to use as a diagnostic tool if you're
Yeah.
looking for consciousness in a brain-injured person?
I think so, and then I'll return to your point, which I think you're right is the binding point. But I want to first interact with Richard. So we're getting better at tracking things like self-organizing criticality, small world network formation in the brain. There's a lot of technical difficulties that have to be worked out. But you know, Indiana and Spores and other people are really hammering away on that part of it. So I think it's reasonable to think the technological problems of getting the theoretical ideas to actually find measurable purchase in the brain. I think there's progress, and it's good reason to believe that's going to become reliable. And then the thing, we are already doing experimentation where you can, like you give people propofol, you take them out of consciousness. It's a general anesthetic, and as you bring them back in, what you can see is when they're unconscious, the brain breaks down into local networks, and then when they become conscious, it reconfigures as a multi-scale small world network. And that, of course, lines up with Tononi's theory in some pretty important ways. Or a similar way, you can, I forget it's another anesthetic was used, and I was talking with Brett Anderson about this recently, and you bring people back, and you can see also self-organizing criticality kicking in again. And that's because the firing and the wiring actually mutually constrain each other. And you can actually do this with binocular rivalry too. So you have an image that's presented to two fields of vision, and they can't be held together, and so phenomenologically you switch between them. And then you can see the self-organizing criticality. This area is firing in synchrony, corresponding to seeing the triangle, and then that breaks up criticality, and this area fires in synchrony when you're now seeing it as the square. And you can actually track the consciousness with the flipping of the self-organizing criticality. So it's already being done experimentally. And then the thing about those is they're not neuroanatomically based. They're functionally based. And what's important about those is they actually point to more comprehensive models, because self-organizing criticality and small world network formation also reliably correlate with measures of general intelligence, which supports the argument I was trying to make that there's a deep connection between the machinery of intelligence and the machinery of consciousness. And so you can start to get empirically tractable ways of testing the very theoretical proposals I was bringing out.
Is there a way of using that approach with someone in ICU? You don't have a lot of space to work with. There's other equipment around. I mean, MRI is limited that way too,
Yeah.
especially with a head injured or brain injured person.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I'm relatively ignorant. Well, no, not relatively. I'm sort of absolutely ignorant in that I don't know enough about that, about the therapeutic context, especially in that sort of palliative situation, about whether, I do know that these technologies are being used in these experiments, and that's already a difficult and clunky thing. But I suppose my answer, Richard, would be I don't see any reason in principle why it couldn't be. I think there's significant practicalities. I would imagine there are significant practicalities, but again, I'm ignorant about I don't know enough about that particular situation. But I mean, we have an enormous success at shrinking the size of technology, increasing its resolution, etc. So again, I don't see any reason in principle why not. It's more an issue, I would guess, of technological practice.
How about this? I know that there have been some clinical studies done with machine learning augmented EEG.
Yes.
Which is really easy to use in an ICU because it's not bulky equipment. And they're getting good results, just simple command following procedures. And the trouble with the EEG, it's pretty noisy. There's a lot of signal noise ratio is not good, right?
And you have to have a huge cohort that you've normalized in order to make the comparison. And I imagine we don't have that for people in this situation. That's a sort of practical difficulty too. Because you can count on, like, if you do it on enough people that might be locked in, right? You could get presumably some way to distinguish noise from signal that is more specific to that phenomenon.
So they're getting their baseline from healthy volunteers.
Exactly. That's my point. And then, and that's fine for experimentation, but that would strike me as something that you'd have to change if you want to move it into the context you're talking about. Why this matters, if that's okay, Richard, why this matters is it's challenging a way we have thought about where we would look, how, let me put it, how we should think about consciousness. We still want consciousness to be a blob that we can find somewhere. And so, so people carry around a blob theory of consciousness. There's some sort of blob, I'm trying to use this really neutral term, right? But there's a blob inside of me, and that's what consciousness is, because that's what our introspective space sort of, I feel like I'm inside a sort of a blob, right? And the problem, and Richard pointed to this, right? Our introspective access is important because in some ways we have to start there, but it doesn't have an ontological priority. And so we have to give up the blob theory of consciousness. That what we're going to find is we're going to find a blob somewhere, and we'll go, there, that's consciousness. And the fact that that was being theoretically and empirically undermined means we have to really, really give that up. And we'll go, and we can sit here and we go, yeah, okay, no, really, really give it up. It really takes a lot to give it up. Because, and this is something, all the way back to Plato, you see Plato bashing his head, right? And the Parmenides is otherwise incomprehensible, the dialogue, because he's trying to get people to realize there are realities that are not spatio-temporal things. And as long as you're thinking of everything, listen to the word, everything as a thing, as a spatio-temporal thing, there's a lot of reality you're going to be missing. And we have to give up the blobby thingy notion of consciousness I'm proposing to you if we're going to find it. And if you think that's a ridiculous thing to say, pay attention to the popular media, because the popular media presents your consciousness, your soul, yourself as a blobby thing. It's probably a different color than you or something stupid like that. That's
no, but you're because you see that also in Christianity. You see it. You see these silly stories. I forget who it was who
the 21 grams
who killed someone and you put them in a barrel, sealed the barrel, and then took the lid off to see if you could see the soul escaping. You know, that kind of nonsense.
Yeah, the 21 grams. He measured the difference, and the soul weighs 21 grams.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm thinking, so it's made out of like hydrogen.
Ectoplasm. It's ectoplasm.
No, but I think that's exactly part of the point of the difficulty of the village understanding this conversation. And I think what you've done, John, in talking about, it's transjective, that is consciousness an electrical network? I mean, that's part of the blob thing.
Yes.
Is it a chemical? And, I mean, all of Jonathan's work has been pointing to it's not material, but it's this place between the material and this other world that in many ways our civilization said, I always call it the lab leak, because we said with science, if I can really focus in, I think McGilchrist, articulates this well. If I can really focus this, and I mean, all the selection you talked about in your talk, I agree. That's one of the best things I've ever heard you do this morning. All this, then we can what? Then we can know. And so if we imagine that it's not love that is drawing this sphere from the Italian tower to the ground, well, then we can, and I think we've gotten to the end of that now and realizing that some of the most important questions, and I loved it when you said, well, here's all we can do. And you said, well, can you do that in an ER? Well, that's pastorally where things come to play. Because what is that lying on the gurney? Is that dad? If you did a biopsy, if you did an autopsy of dad, what of all the things that we knew of dad could they discover in the autopsy? Well, where is that? It's not a chemical. It's a relational. And I think that's exactly where you've been pointing all along.
But I'm curious, John, in terms of what you said, like the measurement, what are they measuring? Because you use words that I don't understand, like small world network and that stuff. I don't know what that is.
And this goes back to the point I was making. The kind of things we're talking about, they're mathematical formalisms for talking about patterns, real patterns.
Yeah.
So the idea of self-organizing criticality actually came from Purbach in physics, although his attempt to apply it to all physical things, he's going to have to modify it. I'll just leave it at that. I won't get into the details. The point is, so you have a column of sand falling, and it will form a mound. And the idea is, well, nobody does it. Nobody's going in and, there's no little gremlins or leprechauns. Well, what's happening? Well, you have a set of constraints. You have friction and gravity and spatial location, and what that does is it self-organizes, and you get a structure emerging, right? But then at some point, the structure goes critical. The structure can't actually maintain its own growth. And what you see in the sand pile is it avalanches. And what happens is that's an increase in entropy. The mutual predictability between the sand particles drops. It goes, right? Now, if there's too much criticality, it breaks. But if there's not, what happens is the avalanche spreads the sand out, and now a bigger base starts to emerge, and it can go higher than it could before. So it cycles between, right? It's self-organizing, and then the criticality means it can transcend as it self-organizes. And what you can look at in the brain is you can look at the part that corresponds to the mound being formed. Neurons they will fire in synchrony together, and when they're firing in synchrony together, that tends to correspond when you get a gestalt in aha, right? And then what they do is they break apart and they fire asynchronously. The entropy goes up, and that allows a new synchrony to form, and then they break apart and a new synchrony, and it oscillates. And this is at many levels of analysis, between small groups of neurons all the way up to the entire brain. And what that is doing, I argue and have argued and published, is that corresponds to frame making and frame breaking in insight. And Stephan and Dixon, for example, have measured entropy when you're going through an aha moment, and that's what happens. You're at this level, and then the entropy really increases, and then you drop to a level that's even more highly ordered in your behavior than before the insight. So you've got an insight, which is a problem-solving experience, phenomenology. It maps into the self-organizing criticality, which you can actually see happening in the brain. That's self-organizing criticality. Small world network I could do too, but it's the self-organizing criticality is how it fires, and the small world network is the way in which your brain connects. So the brain is not connected randomly, and it's not connected regularly. It's connected in this really interesting pattern that tends to optimize between efficiency and resiliency in a network. What's really cool is you'll see the internet organizes as a small world network. Airlines organize as a small world network, right? And so, whoa, and it's like, why? So you get these patterns that are showing up repeatedly, and the idea is they're indicating something fundamental about functionality. And those things are measurable in the brain, but for me what's interesting is they translate up into intelligence and insight, but they also say, you know what's going on in your brain? It's actually the same set of principles that are unpacking reality, right, and organizing reality. So we don't just have a representational relationship, we co-instantiate principles within and without, and that to me is a grounding idea.
But do you think, based on what Richard was saying, let's say in terms of the problem, the medical problem, so are you suggesting that if you could measure that, or you could see that in a brain, that is one of the factors which could lead you to say that someone is experiencing consciousness or not?
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. And so I think, so now I'll make a prediction. This is not the same thing as arguing for conclusion. It's a scientific. I'm predicting that we will get to a place where we will not have to give you psychometric tests in order to test your intelligence. And that's a scary thing, by the way. But
Just measure the pattern in your brain.
Yep. Because they already correlate well with measures of G. The self-organizing criticality. In fact, the flexibility of your self-organizing criticality correlates quite well with measures of G. The degree to the complexity of your small world network formations in your brain corresponds to G, and especially, Jonathan, in the salience network of the brain. That is especially tightly predictive of general intelligence.
And the reason you are scared of that is?
I'm scared of any process which forgoes phenomenal relationship, like anything. Like, I understand in the question of an ICU where you've got someone and you're trying to figure out, like, is this person experiencing qualitative experience? So it's like, I'm going to have a way to try to make sure that I'm not killing a sentient conscious being. But the idea that this can become a manner to test general intelligence is it's Gattaca frightening. It's this idea that you have a child and just measure their brain. It's like, well, you're going to be a plumber and you're going to be a.
So
it's like, that's a frightening thing.
Get the information out to the village, integrate it with a project of the enhancement of the cultivation of wisdom, so that we can beat the military and the governments to the use of this. That's my proposed response to that. Because hoping that the genie doesn't get out of the bottle is a fool's hope.
Yeah.
And the reason I asked you is because, again, we're getting into, once again, this framing of measurement. And, well, there's no leprechaun stacking there's no leprechaun stacking. It's, and it's, again, and I completely understand it's the only language we have, but this is self-organizing.
But it's not the organization of a self.
Right. But we're still using the same word.
We're not. It's an equivocation.
But the village hears the same word.
Okay, but we have the word itself. And an it is something that lacks a self. But we don't go, oh my God, oxymoron, itself.
No,
Right?
That's good.
Right.
That's
right.
good.
Okay. Right. So there's a sense in which the word self, and it's part of the Indo-European proclivity, where all we're meaning by self is this. It recurs on itself.
Right.
That's different from a self. And so when I teach a course on the nature and function of the self, I try to say, how do we go from self-organization to the organization of a self? That's actually a real, deep, and important question. And it's a hard question, but I also think we're making very good progress on it. I feel like I'm in the midst of some sort of Kafkaesque Wizard of Oz thing, because in one sense I feel like I've just come to the Emerald City, because so much progress is happening right now theoretically, and it's like, oh, but like Jonathan, I sometimes go, oh, right?
Who's behind the curtain?
But what, like, if we get a really solid understanding of the self that fits into our science framework, that of course opens us up to technological manipulation that our ignorance about the nature of the self protects us from right now.
Yeah, we had an example in our Rebel Wisdom discussion about how Bernays used Freud's discoveries and weaponized them for advertisement and for state control.
Renaissance Eros magic led to the pervasive systematized bullshitting of advertising in our world. Yes. Direct historical line.
Now, Richard, you've had more motivation to look into these three people putting stuff on YouTube. You sat through 3 of our lectures. You've got a background in consciousness. You teach about this. What are you seeing? What's going on here?
Well, it's sort of fascinating watching the interaction between John and Jonathan.
Is he coming through the mic? I don't, hang on.
A little
Richard.
closer.
Just bring it closer.
Just hold it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, fascinating because it's like you're speaking Russian and you're speaking Italian or something. You're conversant in the two. And I'm getting some of what John is saying, and I'm largely mystified by what you're talking about. So that's what I'm getting.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for us to hear because we love what we're doing. I think it's important for some of them to hear, but I think probably they get it better than we do. And especially because we believe that, as John just said, now we're actually in a physical space together. We're sort of like, we've arrived at the Emerald Kingdom and it's Thunder Bay, but we want to leave a spirit here. So it's critically important for me to hear from you and from some of the others here, what are we leaving with you? And then, I don't know if you're married or not, but come home and, well, what'd you do today? I went to that thing. What did they do to that thing? I'm not really sure, because in terms of my meetup world and my other world, we have these little clusters of people who are coming together saying, I can't talk to my wife about this stuff. She just says, go find someone else to talk to. But we're all thinking, and again, this in some ways models what Scotland was talking about in church, why we're meeting in a space that no longer needs this capacity for a worshiping body. So that's a vital interest to me, what you hear.
But we're not done yet. We've got another whole day.
Oh
to go.
yeah, we're not done,
And
but
it takes a while.
we're well underway.
It takes a while to digest things as well, I think. So email me late next week and I'll give you a better answer.
But as a pastor, and I often think about my role between these two, because I don't feel myself, what's my job when I get these two online, and I'm just like, well, look at them go. And it's almost always to try to help make it in smaller bites so that others can enjoy the feast. And to explain, that's what I've done on my channel. Jordan's going off on this thing. Can I interpret? So that's what I'm doing, because I don't want this to be locked within cloistered walls, whether they're academic or monastic.
How did that end up becoming the monk? How did that actually? He's saying it as if it's an obvious thing, and I'm like, really? Is that the one?
Well, I had one left, and you were it. So sorry, Jonathan.
It's just incredibly obvious to me that you would do better in a monastery than I would. So,
you who said he'd be a potted plant?
I stayed in a monastery when I was in Vermont for the Respond retreat, and I like meditating and contemplating and doing it, but I'm not a monk. That became really clear to me. Well, I'm glad, Richard, you're getting some of what I'm saying because, it's important to me that the work, I'm getting published in journals we both read. And then I'm still feeling like getting published in those journals. I just published in the Journal of Phenomenology and Cognitive Science just 3 weeks ago on this stuff, integrating relevance realization theory, predictive processing, etc. You're getting some of it, that's good. And I feel I'm bridging with Jonathan very well, but I still feel that I wish I could speak a language that wasn't Russian or Italian, but Indo-European, so that we were all, that I was in a more efficacious manner allowing you and Jonathan to talk to each other as well. So I have, in that sense, I need to do a lot more work, I think. But that would be, for me, my non-egoic criterion of success, that I could come up with a proper philosophical vocabulary, theoretical grammar, such that the two of you could talk deeply and intelligibly to each other without necessarily having to agree or even share the same sort of fundamental perspective. That's my goal. And it's clear to me that I need to do a lot more. So thank you for that.
How long have you two been interacting?
3 years, 4 years?
Yeah.
Around there?
Yeah. So I'm engaging in good faith discussion with not just Christians, but people of other faiths, and also people like Ian McGilchrist, right? Like philosophers like John Rusin or Claire Carlyle. And I'm trying to, the reason why I'm attracted to Neoplatonism is Neoplatonism was able to enter, it was this way of thinking, and I'm not trying to be nostalgic here, but it was this way of thinking that could enter into reciprocal reconstruction with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but also science. And it was, and it was the intellectual Silk Road that was flowing along the physical Silk Road. And I talk about it being able to, I use it as a template of, can we come up with a courtyard like Neoplatonism did, where we can have the furniture of intelligibility is so disposed that we can talk deeply to each other. Because I'm trying to replace the courtroom of debate, which has become our prevalent model and is eroding our society in a terrific fashion. And so I very much, and I don't have a better, I'm also by nature drawn to Neoplatonism, and so that's just my personal thing, but I don't have a better template to look to about trying to get that. That's the best historical one, and for me it also maps into a Socratic way of life that I find deeply aspirationally valuable. So that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm saying that to you because I want you to understand why I'm invoking what might sound to you like, why is he doing all this Neoplatonic stuff? That's really weird. But that's the reason. And you can see, John Spencer, The Eternal Law, Neoplatonism and adjacent things came back into the center of things around the beginning of the 20th century when we had the paradigm shift around the Einsteinian and the quantum mechanic. And there's lots of good literature on that. And that has, of course, also fallen away. But it did something there. It allowed these people to talk to each other and bridge between worlds in a powerful way. So that's my attraction to it. That's why, so there's a spiritual, personal attraction, which is sacrosanct for me. But the intellectual attraction is exactly that I want to try and find a way of creating a courtyard of intelligibility so we can get out of the courtroom of debate.
This is very rare, by the way, what you're doing.
Yes.
Because as you know, in the academic world, people tend to divide themselves into little camps.
The silo. Yeah.
And
so,
they each have their own language game.
Yep.
And they, not only don't they communicate, in many cases they can't.
So
But this is really, I think, extraordinary what you're doing, in sort of including such different worldviews.
To me, that is the proper mission of cognitive science, when I'm not just using it as a generic term. I actually present an argument that the job of cognitive science is actually to try and create bridging language between neuroscience, machine learning, psychology, linguistics, and anthropology, using the tools that philosophy has built for trying to bridge between different kinds of discourses, different kinds of ontological frameworks, different kinds of epistemologies. That's what I see as the deep vision of cognitive science. And that is what that's my professional training in the last 30 years. I'm realizing how long I've been teaching and doing this. Death approaches. But I want, so that's my other model. On one hand, I hold the Neoplatonic tradition that did this, and then I resonate with this beloved person profoundly. But I also hold in my other hand my other model, which is cognitive science, and I've been practicing that synoptic integration across these disciplines that all talk about the mind, but like using different languages and different ontologies and different methodologies. And I'm trying to get those two together, because my hope is what comes out of that will give us the best possible model for bridge building.
Because one of the issues, I think, John, is that it's not just a question of language and terminology. I think that the work that has to be done and is starting, I think it's happening, but it's going to be difficult, is that it's a retraining of people too. It's
totally.
not just, so
yes.
but it's a retraining of people in the different camps. And so retraining people who have a deep intuition about faith, for example, to start to realize that the terms that are being used are not just these arbitrary things that you have to believe in order to go to heaven or whatever. Like, they are actually descriptions of reality, and they're descriptions of reality that we are struggling to grasp anymore, because they seem so alien from the way that we're taught reality works. But so the work is actually to help people that are really kind of rational scientists to say, well, you know, these things that ancient peoples were saying, like, they weren't just spouting off nonsense for thousands and thousands of years all over the world. Let's try to, there are ways to understand it, but then even the difficult part is that the religious people are often, they've lost that as well. And so, but I agree that if at the outset, for example, of the Christian transformation, Neoplatonism became the language that the church fathers used to create that bridge. You see that right away in Justin Martyr and in St. Paul, for goodness sake. That the language they use with Neoplatonism, I think your notion or your idea to now come back to that Neoplatonism as a way to recreate that bridge, I mean, I think it's a good
but
drive.
For me, I see that, and then I look at cognitive science, and cognitive science is talking about levels. Like, well, what's the mind? The neuroscientist, it's the brain. Oh, as the machine learning. Oh, no, it's an algorithm, it's heuristics. The psychologist, oh, no, it's working memory and forms of behavior. The linguist, oh, it's language and it's deep structure. And then the anthropologist, no, it's culture, right? And it's like, and they have these levels, and then they have levels of intelligibility and levels of reality, and then everybody knows that the relationship between the levels, there has to be causal flow between the levels. And you even find this in cognition itself, bottom up, top down, emergence, emanation, levels of being, levels of reality. And it's like, oh my gosh, you're talking the language of Neoplatonism through and through. And like, maybe that isn't just a happenstance.
Yeah, right,
maybe that's pointing to something. And so you can make meta arguments about not this particular theory or that. You can make arguments about theorizing and about sort of the emerging frameworks. Like, we just basically have an inverted Neoplatonism right now. Well, there's the levels, and the really real is at the bottom, and you have all the same. You have symmetrical problems that Platonism had, Neoplatonism, and it does have. When there's the levels, and the really real is at the top, right? And they're just symmetrical problems. And so for me, like, the similarities just leap out at me, and I think it's important to get people to explicate what is already so deeply implicit. And that's how I think I want to try. I mean, I do a lot, like you know, about trying to help the training, but this isn't it. Here, this is what I'm trying to say, and I'm fumbling. This isn't something to impose on people. This is something to explicate from within the ligaments of their existing patterns of sense-making, especially within the very best, which is, right, sense-making attempts like within the scientific world. That's the point I'm making. This is what my original paper was titled, Relevance Realization and the Emerging Framework in Cognitive Science. I wasn't opposing something. I was saying all of these different areas are converging on this, and we can explicate that. That's what I'm trying to say. So I agree we're retraining, but it's not something that should alienate you. It should
No, it
something
happens
that
through
can,
insight.
Pardon me?
It happens through insight.
Yes,
but
it's like Plato's anamnesis. It's a kind of remembering and recognizing, not from something heteronymous to you, but something that actually is already implicit in the very sinews of how you're making sense. And this isn't just my idea. This is an idea that's being developed in cognitive science. Evan Thompson's deep continuity hypothesis, etc.
One of the things that Richard said, which struck me, was a number of people that I've spoken with here said, a medical doctor said to me, we could never do this as medical doctors.
To which?
What we're doing here,
Oh.
this kind of conversation. I've had others say to me similar things, whether it's the academy or other disciplines, often disciplines of high status and disciplines of particular authority in our culture. And I guess I would, again, I'd like to pivot from the zombie image to much more of a sleepwalker image. Because I don't know that culturally we are, I get the zombie image, but I think a sleepwalker image is a little bit more optimistic, because sleepwalkers can wake up. What do you do with a zombie? And what I see in terms of these framing questions that we're all located in, and what I love about the speech you just gave, John, and Jonathan's continual admonition, and every time he has to do what he tried to do to you, to say, I'm going to try to have you understand me. I've watched him do it with Adam Friended and Rationality Rules. In many ways, what he is saying to Western people is, this is the stuff that allows you to sleepwalk. And if you're really going to flourish, I'd love you to wake up and see all that is actually going on around you. And to not only, because what's the difference between a sleepwalker and someone who is awake? Now I know we're getting on some difficult words here and associations, but the person who is awake has agency. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I mean, you brought in the image of an addict. There's this, and I think again, John gives us the language. There's reciprocal narrowing, and I even though it hasn't been forefronted a lot in this event, when I listened to John speak with passion, I was going to ask you, okay, if you could know Indo-European, what would happen out there? And I think what you're saying is not terribly far from what Jonathan is saying, which is I want the village to live. I want the village to live. I don't want the reciprocal narrowing. Mm-hmm. I want the reciprocal broadening. I want their agency expanded. I want their wisdom expanded. And you said I mean, the point that got the applause, can we do this without dogma? I've still got to engage with your Lex Fridman because I've got some points for you, but that'll come on YouTube. But, and for your desire to leave a spirit here, I think that's what you want too. You want that they will live, and you want them that they would know life in abundance. And someone said that before me, so I'll leave it there.
I'm sorry, what you said was good, and I was smiling not because of any ridicule. I thought you were going to say, with all the sleepwalkers, what we need to do is awaken from the meaning crisis.
Well, we are about to transition into a time with more engagement with the audience for 2 hours. But before I explain how we're going to do that, I am going to take a little bit of space and engage with something that John just said, because I can't help myself.
Just like your brother.
I am like my brother. I was really caught when you were talking about how the current and modern scientific model, the really real, has been down here.
Yeah.
And in Neoplatonism, it was up here.
Yes.
And I think right
Early
now...
Neoplatonism, late Neoplatonism had them completely interdependent. Yeah.
But right now, I feel like we're experiencing a cultural whiplash because
Yes.
it's been down here for so long.
Yes.
And that now up here, you see people capturing and living out identities that are unhooked from down here,
Yes.
and they just live up here. And that's why I think, for those of you who haven't had a chance to talk to me, I'm a psychotherapist. So I work with people all the time, and I see this all the time.
Lots of spiritual bypassing going on, right?
Yes.
Right. And you've got the fully automated luxury Gnosticism that's becoming prevalent in affluent.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I totally agree. And so for me, the fact that cognitive science is moving into 4E, where embodiment is a constitutive feature of being a cognitive agent, is important ballast against, right, flipping the other way. And then what we're going to do is we're going to liberate ourselves from the fact that we're embodied and embedded and bound into inaction, and we're extended through, and we depend on other people. No, we're going to have a completely self-defining Gnosticism that is in no way beholding to the 4Es. And this is like, what? Yeah, I agree. The flip is as bad as the thing it's flipping from.
Absolutely. And I'm passionate about people being able to come to know themselves within their full self, their embodied being, which is why I wanted to be embodied with everyone here as a group and as a person, but be able to then have a life-giving identity that can be a part of that and connect that top and bottom. And so having this conversation, I think, is essential, because otherwise all you'll be left with is people without a guiding path grabbing things from the top to anchor an identity, but then it's because it's not connected all the way through, they lose their way, and it produces so much suffering. And so I think if we can find a way to talk about consciousness, which engages with how you act, how you behave, who you are, how that links you into your community, if we can do that well, we can help people find a path through a lot of these things.
I totally. And so, recursive relevance realization is not cold calculation, but it's ultimately dependent on the bioeconomics of you being an embodied being. It's sub-representational, it's sub-computational, and many of you know the arguments about that, and I won't review them. It's there. Richard, I can point you to the stuff I published on it. That means it actually, your body isn't just a vessel, it isn't just Cartesian clay that you mold. The bioeconomics of your body, to use more technical language, the cost functions it puts up for efficiency and resiliency, or what's now called degeneracy, which is a really stupid term they've used because people hear moral depravity. Academics, we need to get better at naming things for the village. But all of those things, like embodiment, if you aren't, like, the reason, we care for this information rather than that, unlike a computer, because we are beings that are constituted by taking care of ourselves. We are autopoietic beings. And because we are constantly making ourselves, we are taking care of ourselves, and that means we have to care about some information rather than others. And many people are arguing that you can't separate caring from embodiment. It actually doesn't make any sense. So the fully automated luxury Gnosticism, I think, is deeply mistaken and ultimately nonsensical. And that can't be a way of helping people. That can't be a way of helping people.
Thank you.